So I thank Dr. Melvin and New Orleans Opera for having us tonight, and thank you all for tuning in. I'll just launch right in. At the time of the Civil War, there were roughly 4 million people of African descent enslaved in the United States. There was another about 500,000 of Black people who were free, either born free, manumitted, or self-emancipated by running away. The vast majority of the nation's free people of color lived in urban areas. And while in 1860, Baltimore claimed the largest free Black population, New Orleans had the most literate, the most propertied, and the most cosmopolitan group of free people of color in the country. And this made New Orleans an anomaly. It was home to the most prominent free Black community, while at the same time being the largest slave market in the nation. So the term free people of color is first and foremost a legal category that denoted a status as well as a racialized identity. In Louisiana, the category free person of color included people born in Africa, people born in the New World. It included people of only African descent, as well as people of mixed racial descent. And the majority of free people of color in Louisiana were French-speaking, Catholic, often identified themselves as Creoles. But free people of color could also be English-speaking, usually Protestant. They were often referred to as American, meaning that they or their parents were born outside of Louisiana. Our focus tonight is on French-speaking free people of color, or gens de couleur libre, whose descendants, especially after the Civil War, when the legal categories of slave and free person of color no longer existed, often referred to themselves as Creoles or Creoles of color. Our talk explores the lives of French-speaking free people of color using objects from the historic New Orleans collection, as well as a few other archives, and those are marked on the PowerPoint. We will look at how free people of color created a community within New Orleans slave society and their significant impact on the city from its founding to the end of the 19th century. While free people of color occupied a precarious legal and social position between white people and the larger enslaved population in New Orleans, they made lasting contributions to the city and to the cause of racial equality.
It's important for us to remember that less than 60 short years prior to the start of the Civil War, the Queen City of the South, New Orleans, was still very much a European colonial outpost. From its founding by the French in 1718, New Orleans had been home to a largely Francophone Catholic population, which included Europeans, Native Americans, and people of African descent. French Louisiana was a frontier society into which slavery was introduced. However, it never materialized the wealth of a colonial Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, nor did it have the organization and the development of Quebec or Montreal. In an attempt to supplement the number of enslaved Native Americans, the first enslaved people from Africa were brought to Louisiana in 1719. While indigo and tobacco were grown as early cash crops, these enslaved Africans performed the vital work of growing the foodstuffs and developing public works, such as improving drainage and heightening levees. They also used their skills to expand the built environment of the city. The vast majority of these enslaved people were brought from Senegal to French Louisiana between 1719 and 1731 under the auspices of the Company of the Indies. This led early on to the formation of an enslaved Creole population in tandem with the first generation natives of the New World whose parents were born in the Old World, such as Africa or Europe. While most Africans in Louisiana were enslaved during the French period, some Africans and their descendants gained freedom through a variety of means. The earliest record concerning a free person of color dates to 1722. The classification for free person of color was already incorporated into French colonial law through the Code Noir or Black Code, which was first promulgated in 1685 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. It was modified and applied to Louisiana in 1724. But unlike in Saint-Domingue, where manumissions could be passed at the owner's will, manumissions in Louisiana had to pass before the colony's superior council, its governing body. The French made it more difficult for enslaved people to gain their freedom in Louisiana in an attempt to control the expansion of a free Black population. Outlawing marriages and concubinage between whites and Blacks was another way of doing this. Of course, these laws were difficult to enforce, and interracial relationships were not uncommon. These relationships, primarily between French men and African women, often led to manumission of the enslaved women and their children. The second article of the Code Law mandated that all slaves be baptized and instructed in the Catholic faith. Participation in the Catholic sacraments was an implicit acknowledgement of their spiritual, if not social, equality. It created relationships of comparage, or godparenthood, spiritual kinship between enslaved, free Blacks, and European settlers. The Ursa Lines, a cloistered order of nuns dedicated to the education of women, came to Louisiana in August 1727, and soon thereafter began a sodality, or lay society, through which women of all stations were evangelized. Inasmuch as their mission is education, the Ursa Lines offered instruction to women who were European, Native American, and African. The Ursa Lines also catechized the enslaved families they owned. Among these women was Marie-Anne, called Nanette Dubreuil, a Wolof woman who was enslaved in Louisiana by Marie Payen and Claude Dubreuil. Both Nanette and her mistress enrolled in the Ursuline sodality. Nanette gave birth to 5 children by her owner, Claude Dubreuil, and 9 years after his death, she was manumitted by a private act signed by Governor Kellerick. Nanette's great-great-granddaughter, Henriette de Lille, born in 1812, later founded what is the second oldest community of Black religious sisters in this country. In addition to individual acts of manumission, such as Nanette's, freedom also came by way of military service, and a number of free men of color were enlisted to aid in fighting against neighboring Native American troops and were rewarded with their freedom. In the 1736 campaign against the Chickasaw, an enslaved man named Simon Calfa earned his freedom through his valorous service. In 1769, almost 3 decades later, he was one of 34 free Black militiamen who swore their allegiance to the new Spanish regime. Calfa served as captain of the Free Black Militia, an institution that took on an even greater significance in the Spanish period.
In 1762, France ceded Louisiana to Spain, its Bourbon ally. This is during the 7 Years' War. Oh my gosh, I skipped some. Okay. This is a cool document. This is Simon Calfa's signature on that 1769 document that Jari was just mentioning. Got a little behind there. All right. So seven Years' War ends, and North America is split now between the British, the red on the right, and the Spanish in yellow on the left. Spain's governance of Louisiana doesn't effectively fully take effect, I guess, until 1769, we would say, when Governor Alejandro O'Reilly finally arrives with his troops from Cuba. And the Spanish are going to continue to rule Louisiana until shortly, very shortly, before the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But the Spanish period saw a dramatic increase of both the enslaved population and the free Black population. So large numbers of enslaved Africans are being brought through the transatlantic slave trade. And at the same time, the free Black population grew significantly, and it was aided by Spanish laws and customs. This growth, combined with rights of property ownership and institutions like the militia, assisted in the development of a free people of color community in New Orleans. So unlike the French, the Spanish encouraged the increase in the number of free people of color. And this is for a couple of reasons. A free Black population was beneficial to the Spanish government because free men and women of color filled a labor demand, especially in the building and retail trades. A free Black population promoted social stability in part by establishing a status to which enslaved people could aspire. And third, they provided defense for an underpopulated colony. So scholar Shannon Doughty suggests that there were an estimated 400 to 800 free people of color living in Louisiana at the end of the French period. And by the end of the Spanish period, just 40 years later, that number had almost doubled. And this considerable growth occurred by a variety of means, from manumissions, natural increase, as well as small numbers of immigrants from French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Latin America. Between 1771 and 1803, over 1,900 enslaved people received their freedom through several forms of legal manumission. The highest number of manumissions were voluntary, or what the Spanish called gracioso, meaning an enslaver voluntarily and without compensation manumitted an enslaved person. Slave owners did not need permission from the government to do this. They just needed a legal document. They could use a notary record. They could use a last will and testament. Enslaved children could even be freed through baptism records. In fact, the majority of enslaved people who received their freedom through voluntary manumission were children under the age of 13. And in many cases, certainly not all, the enslaver was also the white father of these children. But Spanish law also included another form of manumission known as coartación, or self-purchase. And this law allowed for enslaved individuals or others on their behalf to buy their freedom. And often an enslaved person would work out a payment with the slave owner for their freedom. But if the enslaver refused to agree to a sum, the enslaved person had the right to ask the court to mediate a price that the enslaver then had to accept. Over 1,000 enslaved men, women, and children gained their freedom through this system. One good example is a woman named Marie Louise. She bought herself and her 4 children for $500 from her master, who was a white army officer. Now, whether manumitted voluntarily, through self-purchase, or by a third-party purchase, women gained their freedom at a higher rate than men. For one thing, there were more women of African descent in New Orleans than men. And there are also better opportunities for Black women to earn money in the urban port to purchase their freedom. Relationships, forced or otherwise, with white men could also lead to freedom for enslaved women. The free people of color population also grew naturally over generations, and the children of freed and free Black women were born free, which meant that free Black families began to enjoy the status of multi-generational freedom during this period. In addition to the legal means by which people of African descent were freed, some enslaved individuals took matters into their own hands and emancipated themselves by running away. During the Spanish period, settlements of maroons, or escaped slaves, could be found in the swamps outside of New Orleans. The most well-known group of maroons were led by a man named St. Malo, who established settlements in land between the Mississippi River and Lake Borgne, which is the area there marked on the map. But self-emancipation could also occur in urban settings like New Orleans, where it was sometimes possible to live as free. This was the case for a man named Noel Carrier, who lived as a free man for almost a decade before then legally gaining his freedom. So Carrier was born in New Orleans to enslaved parents in the mid-1740s. He worked as a cooper and a tanner, and he purchased his own freedom for $500 in 1771. Carrier was also a member of the Free Black Militia under the command of Simon Calfa, who we know gained his freedom during the French period. The Spanish expanded the Free Black Militia to include multiple companies, and by 1801, 469 men served in 2 battalions. These soldiers played an important role in defense of the colony. They participated in combat against Native Americans and the British, most notably during the American Revolution. Both Noel Carrier and Simon Calfa served in Governor Bernardo de Galvez's campaigns against the British in Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola, which is shown here in 1781. And both men received medals of honor and pay bonuses for their bravery during these expeditions. But Free Black militia members had other duties as well. They were often called upon to capture maroons, like St. Malo's band. They were used to fix levees, to fight fires, and to patrol New Orleans overnight. But the militia was a key social institution for free men of color during the Spanish and early American periods. Militia service bestowed honor and influence on its free Black members and allowed for social mobility and the construction of community power. Militiamen formed strong social networks through friendships and kinships. Members often married the sisters and daughters of other militiamen. In 1777, Noel Carrier, for example, married Mariana Thomas, the daughter of Pierre Thomas, one of the 34 soldiers who served with the French. Officers especially rose to prominent positions in their social networks and helped solidify the free people of color community by participating in social customs like baptisms and weddings, serving as godfather to their fellow militiamen's children and witnessing their marriage ceremonies. In fact, between 1790 and his death in 1804, Noel Carrier was witness at 30 free Black weddings. Free people of color occupied much of the skilled trades in Spanish New Orleans. Men worked as carpenters, masons, furniture makers, tailors, shoemakers, coopers, and blacksmiths, just to name a few. This armoire, for example, is attributed to Celestine Glapion. It was made in the late Spanish or early American periods. Born into slavery in St. Charles Parish, Glapion was freed as a child. He eventually moved to New Orleans, where he trained to be a cabinet maker. Free Black builders helped develop the city, designing and constructing houses and other buildings. Raphael Barnabé, a free Black joiner who gained his freedom in 1775, was hired to create all of the woodwork in the Cabildo, which is the Spanish government building, of course, still here on Jackson Square. Women worked as laundresses, seamstresses, midwives, cooks, tavern keepers, and landlords. In addition to these and other occupations, free and enslaved women of color dominated the retail trades, selling fabrics, food, and other necessities throughout the city and to nearby plantations. And this work was a primary means by which enslaved women were able to purchase their freedom and that of their family members. A woman named Marguerite Trudeau, for example, earned her living as a retailer. And in 1782, she was able to purchase the freedom of her son for $800. Free people of color also utilized their earnings to buy property, including land, houses, and enslaved people. Both French and Spanish law bestowed equal rights of property ownership and the ability to make contracts to all free people. Under the Spanish, free people of color were also able to receive donations of property from other free people of color as well as white people. In his 1797 will, a white man named Pedro Casalar left 5 enslaved people, furniture, a farm, and $1,000 to a free woman of color named Charlotte Wiltz and their 4 daughters. Free women of color utilized these rights to accumulate property and earn money as landlords, entrepreneurs, tavern owners, farmers, and slave owners. During the Spanish period, free women of color not only outnumbered free men of color, they also outowned them, possessing more property and more valuable property than their male counterparts. This 1808 land survey drawn up for Agnes Matthew shows one of several properties she owned in the city and the surrounding area. Women like Matthew worked hard to acquire property to pass on to future generations. The financial well-being of free families of color in the pre-Civil War period were often built on the foundation created by free women of color during the Spanish period.
In the years following the sale of Louisiana to the United States in 1803, the free population of color, of course, continued to grow. The community that began to form in the Spanish period through kinship ties and social networks developed even further with the creation of institutions. The Louisiana Purchase, however, brought immediate and long-term changes that impacted free people of color. But to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, we first have to discuss the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 as a large-scale uprising of enslaved men and women in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, and ultimately resulted in the end of slavery and the creation of the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. It, of course, also led to the introduction of musicians and theater owners to New Orleans, including in 1797, André Guetry's Sylvain, which became the first operatic production in the city. In the final stage of the Haitian Revolution, however, Saint-Domingueans of African descent, those who were free before the revolution and those who had formerly been enslaved, joined forces and defeated the French troops sent by Napoleon to take back control of the colony. This ended Napoleon's dreams of a new world empire, including Louisiana, and led him to offer to sell the territory to the United States. At first, this regime change seemed promising. Some free Black militiamen saw the purchase of Louisiana as an opportunity for increased political participation, as evident by the letter they sent to the new territorial governor, William C.C. Claiborne, just 2 weeks later, signed by 55 militia members who referred to themselves as free citizens of Louisiana. They offered their military services and loyalty to the American Republic. They expressed hope for the future while also proactively staking a claim for their rights under American rule. Quote, "We are duly sensible that our personal and political freedom is thereby assured to us forever, and we are also impressed with the fullest confidence in the justice and liberality of the government towards every class of citizens which they have taken under their protection." While Governor Claiborne was nervous about an armed group of free men of color, especially in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. Whites in the United States feared that a similar rebellion could take place here, particularly in the newly acquired French-speaking Louisiana territory with its large population of both enslaved and free Black people. But Claiborne, ever the politician, did not want to anger this influential group of militiamen. So he attempted to appease both sides by allowing the militia to continue, but with white officers in charge. The very next year, however, the territorial legislature disbanded the colonial free Black militia. Part of Claiborne's fears stemmed from the demographic shift occurring in New Orleans at the same time. As the Haitian Revolution ended, a few thousand refugees from Saint-Domingue arrived in New Orleans. This trickle became a flood in 1809 and 1810, when over 10,000 refugees arrived from Cuba, where they had first resettled. This group was almost evenly divided between free whites, free people of color, and enslaved people. Their arrival effectively doubled the city's population. Sharing a common tongue and a common culture with the Louisiana Creoles, these new arrivals found much in common with the Francophone community in New Orleans, including the experience of military service. In 1812, Louisiana became a state, and the United States entered into its first international conflict with Great Britain. This persuaded white legislators to authorize the creation of a limited free Black militia, and it was only a matter of time before they would be called upon to defend the city. By late 1814, the War of 1812 had moved south. British troops launched an offensive to cut off access to the Mississippi River. The British campaign to take New Orleans began in December, and citizens of this region, a diverse group of US troops and volunteers, scrambled to defend the city. Among those forces were 2 free Black battalions, including 350 New Orleanians in the 1st Battalion and 250 Saint-Domingue refugees of color in the 2nd Battalion. These troops would have included men like Noel Carrier's son, who carried on the family tradition of military service. Some of the men who fought in the 1st Battalion had also signed the earlier petition to Governor Claiborne, men such as Carpenter Jean-Louis Dolio. The 2nd Battalion was led by Joseph Savory, a Saint-Domingue refugee who had also fought in the Haitian Revolution. Ultimately, these free Black veterans of the Battle of New Orleans did not receive the political equality they believed their loyalty and service to their new country would provide. Instead, over the next few decades leading up to the Civil War, free people of color faced increasing restrictions as Anglo-American understandings of race began to erode the earlier French and Spanish laws and customs. By the 1830s, Louisiana had once again outlawed a free Black militia, and many of these free men of color who were craftsmen and property owners turned their attention toward creating their own institutions, such as the Association of Colored Veterans of 1814-15 and mutual aid organizations like the Société des Artisans and the Société d'économie, or Economy Society, whose hall is pictured here. These organizations provided outlets for creative, social, and political efforts, as well as leadership by the free Black artisans and businessmen. The period after the Battle of New Orleans saw an explosion of Anglo-American migration into the newly created lower South states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and a dramatic growth in the domestic slave trade. Between 1790 and 1820, the US had acquired new territory by force and violence against Native American tribes and cessions from Spanish to French and the British. As a result, newly transplanted farmers and veteran planters moved into these lands with a need for enslaved laborers to tend to the cash crops of cotton and sugar, which grew so well in these areas. Planters in the upper South were eager to sell enslaved people as the land there could no longer support tobacco. By 1820, New Orleans was the 5th largest city in the country and the largest slave market in the United States. Slavery was the economic engine for the expansion of the nation westward and into the Deep South, as well as the height of prosperity that this city reached prior to the Civil War. It, of course, had major consequences for free people of color. As the population of enslaved people grew, there was a fear of potential rebellion led by or in cooperation with free people of color.
In the decades leading up to the Civil War, French-speaking free people of color built a cohesive community through family connections, property ownership, social networks, and institution building. But as the economic growth of this period helped free people of color increase their relative wealth with business and property ownership, they were also faced with more restrictive laws that made it more difficult to manumit enslaved people, laws that made it more difficult for free people of color to inherit, laws that limited interracial activity, established separate seating in theaters and on the streetcars, and restricted free Black immigration into Louisiana. In 1810, the population of New Orleans was basically divided into thirds among white people, free people of color, and enslaved people. By 1840, the number of free people of color had tripled from 5,000 to 15,000. And the community had spread beyond the French Quarter into newly created neighborhoods, especially the faubourgs Treme and Marigny. Free people of color took advantage of the growing city by investing in real estate and helping to develop the new faubourgs as builders, buyers, and residents. Some individuals, like the merchant tailor Francois Lacroix, became extremely wealthy through real estate. But most people owned more modest holdings, like cabinet maker Michel de Berg, who owned just one house in the Marigny. Now, cabinet makers made furniture like the armoire we saw before, like the one you see here. This one was made around 1840 by Dutriel Barjon, a free man of color who was born in Jérémie, Haiti, and came to New Orleans during the Haitian Revolution. He apprenticed with Jean Rousseau, another refugee. Barjon made furniture as well as imported and sold pieces in his shop on Royal Street. And as a skilled craftsman, he also trained at least 10 apprentices of his own, including his son. He also owned as many as 8 enslaved men and women who worked in his shop and his home in the French Quarter. As in the colonial period, free people of color in the early 19th century owned enslaved men, women, and children. Some owned enslaved people for the same reason that white people did. In a slave society, slaves were the primary source of cheap labor and a financial investment. Enslaved people performed a variety of jobs in New Orleans, and their labor could be rented out. And because enslaved people were also considered property, enslavers could borrow money by mortgaging them. But free people of color were also slave owners in some cases because they owned their relatives. In fact, 63% of people manumitted by a free person of color in the pre-Civil War period had a familial relationship. And during this period, manumission laws become more restrictive, making it difficult for a family member to emancipate a relative that they held in bondage. Now, in addition to slave ownership, the Barjon family is a good example of several common patterns found among free people of color in terms of marriage and family connections. In 1821, Dutrell Barjon, the Sandemangan, married Eulalie Lana, who was a native of New Orleans. The couple had 5 children. Sandemangan free men of color like Barjon found it easier to join the New Orleans free Black community through legal marriage because free women of color far outnumbered free men of color in the city. Barjon's wife Eulalie was the daughter of a free woman of color named Celeste Maxon and a white man named Jean Lana, who owned numerous properties in the French Quarter. Eulalie's father, Jean Lana, is what historian Emily Clark calls a bachelor patriarch. This is a white man who had a long-term relationship with a woman of color that resulted in a family, but who never married. While relationships between couples like Jean Lana and Celeste Maxon were often like marriages, it was against Louisiana state law for the couple to wed. Therefore, their children, like Eulalie and her 3 siblings, were considered quote unquote natural. That meant they were born out of wedlock, but they were recognized by their father. When Jean Lana died in 1844, he left his 4 free children of color property in his will, although the law limited how much he could give them. And in fact, most of his estate had to go to his 2 white siblings because of the law. By the 1830s and 1840s, French-speaking free people of color began to develop their own institutions, from mutual aid societies, music and literary societies, social clubs, to religious organizations and schools. Now, most of these groups were founded by men, like the Société d'Économie that Jari mentioned earlier, or the Philharmonic Society, which was led by musicians Constantin Duberc and Charles Richard Lambert. But women founded and created institutions as well. For women, the Catholic Church offered a space for empowerment and community building similar to that of the militia for men. In fact, free women of color made up the majority of parishioners who attended Mass, and this was a presence that visitors to the city often commented upon, and it was a real resource for priests that they really relied on free women of color to help sustain the church. One of these women was Henriette Delille, who we mentioned previously. When Delille was born, she inherited the legacy of 4 generations of Catholic women that began with her great-great-grandmother Nanette in the French period. Delille's devotion to the Catholic Church benefited the diocese as she stood as godmother at more than a dozen baptisms of young people and adults. Through godparenting, free people of color united families into a coherent community while creating strong connections to one of the most important institutions in the city. When Delille tried to become a nun, she was refused because of her color. So between 1836 and 1852, Delille and 2 other free women of color, Juliette Godin and Josephine Charles, developed the Sisters of the Holy Family, which began as a lay confraternity and became a full-fledged religious order of free women of color. The order ran a school and eventually an orphanage in the Faubourg Treme, and of course it still continues today and still has a school. Since the colonial period, free Black education in New Orleans existed through small private schools, the Ursa Lines, and apprenticeships. In 1847, a group of freemen of color founded a school in the Faubourg Marigny in fulfillment of the bequest of a free woman of color named Marie-Justine Cerner-Couvent. Couvent was born in West Africa and enslaved as a child in Saint-Domingue, where she eventually gained her freedom. After the Haitian Revolution, she relocated to New Orleans, where she purchased property in the French Quarter and in the Marigny, and married a carpenter named Bernard Couvent. In her will, Couvent left her property in the Marigny to be a free school for the orphans of color in the neighborhood. The school created on her property in 1847 was called l'Institution Catholique des Orphelins Indigents, but it was often referred to as the Couvent School. A school existed on Couvent's land at the corner of Dauphine and Touré Streets for over 150 years. And in the decade before the Civil War, the Couvent School became the leading school for free Black children to attend. The principal was Armand Lanous, the editor of Les Senelles. This is the first published collection of poetry by Black people in the United States. And the school provided a space where free people of color advanced their intellectual, cultural, and political development and honed their leadership skills. Lanous oversaw a talented teaching staff that included prominent free Black writers, intellectuals, and activists. The curriculum provided a practical education for the students, but the teachers also promoted a distinct political and racial consciousness in their pupils. Drawing on the examples of the Haitian and French revolutions, Lanous and his fellow teachers encouraged students to look to the broader Atlantic world for examples of citizenship and opportunity for Black people. This ledger book was written by a man named Pierre Aristide de Dune, and both Aristide and his brother Rodolphe attended the Couvent School in the 1850s. During this decade, free people of color faced increased racial violence and oppressive local, state, and federal laws. At the same time, the number of European immigrants to New Orleans skyrocketed, leading to fierce competition for jobs and an overall decrease in the percentage of free people of color in the city's total population. In fact, some families actually left. They escaped the unequal treatment in the United States by moving to Mexico and Haiti. But those who stayed worked hard to maintain their rights as restrictions on them increased. The Civil War, however, dramatically changed the political landscape. Union troops took control of New Orleans in April 1862. Oh, excuse me. Here's a passport, somebody who's going to Haiti. The occupation of New Orleans begins in April 1862. Federal occupation provided the politically astute free people of color community with a sense of hope for the future and opportunities to assert their ideas about rights, equality, and citizenship. And many of the leaders and activists during this period had connections to the Couvent School as teachers, board members, and former students. And because of their education, resources, their sense of community, and this kind of French Atlantic perspective, Francophone free people of color were poised to lead the fight for civil rights and racial equality during the Civil War and Reconstruction.
The free men of color seized upon the opportunities presented by the Union occupation in two immediate ways. First, they offered their services to the Union Army. By August of 1862, 3 regiments of free Black Union soldiers had been formed. A number of French-speaking free Black community leaders served as officers in these regiments, including Captain Andre Caillou, whose wife taught at the Couvent School. Military service in this war further bolstered free men of color's claims for equal rights, and they drew parallels to their ancestors' service in the Battle of New Orleans and the Haitian Revolution. These soldiers proved themselves on the battlefield. At the Battle of Port Hudson in May of 1863, depicted here, Captain Caillou bravely led his company in multiple charges against the Confederate lines, continuing to lead his men even after being shot in the arm. Following Caillou's death in battle, a huge public funeral was held in New Orleans where lines of mourners stretched for over a mile. The second action taken by free men of color was to start a newspaper. In September of 1862, Dr. Louis-Charles Roudenet and his brother Jean-Baptiste Roudenet founded a newspaper called L'Union, the Union. The editor was Paul Trevine, a teacher at the Couvent School. Printed in both French and English, L'Union and its 1864 successor, the New Orleans Tribune, served as radical mouthpieces for these French-speaking free Black leaders and their English-speaking African-American and progressive white allies. The newspapers printed articles, editorials, and poetry that laid out a clear vision for post-war society. They called for the end of slavery and racial discrimination, demanded full citizenship, including universal male suffrage and equal access to public accommodation, transportation, and schools. These free Black activists took their message all the way to the White House. In April 1864, Jean-Baptiste Roudenet and Arnold Berthenot, who served as an officer in the Union Army, traveled to Washington, D.C., where they presented a petition signed by almost 1,000 free men of color in favor of expanding voting rights to men of color in Louisiana. After the meeting, Lincoln suggested to Louisiana's governor to allow some educated Black Union veterans to vote. But Governor Hahn ignored this idea, and the new state constitution approved in 1864 did not grant the vote to people of African descent. By the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination, ex-Confederates controlled Louisiana's government and implemented a series of laws aimed at returning freed men and freed women to a form of slavery. In 1866, Republicans called for a new constitutional convention, one which would include Black male suffrage. On July 30th of that year, Republican delegates met in the Mechanics Institute, which at the time was used as the state capitol. Black supporters of the convention marched to the building, where they were met by a large mob of armed white men. The mob attacked the marchers and the delegates inside. Federal troops had to be called in to stop the violence. Ultimately, over 150 people were injured and at least 45 people were killed, most of whom were Black. The Mechanics Institute massacre was one of several violent events that pushed Republicans in Congress to pass the Reconstruction Acts, which included military rule and the creation of new state constitutions in former Confederate states. Delegates chosen to write the new Louisiana Constitution convened in New Orleans in 1867. 50 of the 98 delegates were men of African descent, including Arnold Burtenow, the Union veteran who had presented the petition to President Lincoln. The 1868 Constitution was arguably the most progressive of all of the Reconstruction era constitutions. And this is in no small part due to the ideas and the activism of these free-speaking former free men of color, such as the Rudenezes, Burtenow, and Trevine. In addition to giving Black men the right to vote, the Constitution abolished discriminatory labor laws and guaranteed to all citizens the same civil, political, and public rights, and included measures that outlawed segregation in government buildings, private businesses, licensed by the state, transportation, and public schools. The success of the convention's delegates to create such a progressive constitution was assisted by grassroots activism during this period. Long before the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, activists in New Orleans were using tactics like civil disobedience, protests, and lawsuits to integrate public transportation and schools. In the spring of 1867, for example, this grassroots activism led to the integration of the city's streetcars. And another occurrence of civil disobedience, which led to a federal lawsuit, in 1869, Eugene Victor Mccarty, a French-trained free Black composer, sat in a whites-only section of the St. Charles Theater and was ultimately expelled from the theater and filed suit, which was ultimately dismissed. Between 1868 and the end of Reconstruction in 1877, these Louisianians of African descent worked to exercise their rights as laid forth in the Constitution. It required a constant struggle, and their efforts were often met with resistance and outright violence. By 1875, however, Black New Orleanians had achieved a considerable degree of desegregation through their community-wide efforts.
So following the end of Reconstruction, white conservative Democrats quickly took control of Louisiana's government. They passed a new constitution in 1879 that eliminated language guaranteeing equal rights to public places, education, to public places. A shoemaker named Omer Plessy came of age in the aftermath of the adoption of the 1879 Constitution. Plessy, who was born in 1863, grew up in during a time that was in many ways radically different from that of his parents. Slavery no longer existed, which meant neither did the category free person of color. Plessy could ride integrated streetcars, he could attend integrated schools, he could look forward to voting and perhaps imagine running for elected office one day. These rights had been hard won by French-speaking Creole and English-speaking African-American activists and their white radical Republican allies, men that included Plessy's stepfather, Victor M. Dupart, who served in the Union Army and was active in politics in the 1870s. Yet by the time Omer Plessy was a teenager, these rights were being rolled back by white conservative political leaders. As a young man, Plessy became part of the next generation of Creole activists who continued to organize against laws and practices that sought to separate people by color, limit Black political participation, and uphold white supremacy. He joined other emerging leaders like Rodolphe Desdunes and older activists like Paul Trevine. In 1887, Plessy became vice president of the Justice Protective Educational and Social Club, which was created, quote, for the purpose of uniting to make sure our rights as citizens of this state and of the United States are protected and respected. In 1890, the Louisiana legislature passed the Separate Car Act, a law that mandated railroad companies to enforce segregated seating in their trains with designated white and colored cars. With the passage of this bill, Rodolphe Desdunes, Omer Plessis, and Louis Martinet, and several other members of the Justice Protective Educational and Social Club launched a coordinated challenge to racial segregation that eventually reached the United States Supreme Court in the 1896 case Plessis v. Ferguson. In September 1891, they formed the Clementi De Citizens, or the Citizens Committee, whose members included lawyers, business owners, teachers, and writers, and drew from both older and younger generations of activists. The Citizens Committee set up two cases to contest the Separate Car Act. The first one involved the planned arrest of Rodolphe Desdunes' son, Daniel, on an interstate train trip. Judge John Ferguson dismissed the charges against Desdunes in 1892, ruling that regulation of interstate travel fell under the federal government's domain. The committee's second case required Omer Plessis to get arrested in the quote-unquote white car on an intrastate trip. He booked a ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad for a trip across Lake Pontchartrain, with his planned arrest happening not long after the train left the Press Street station. Plessis was chosen for the test case because of his light skin tone meant that he physically appeared white from several generations of racial mixture on both sides of his family. The racial ambiguity of Plessis and Daniel Desdunes before him helped Creole activists make clear the absurdity of racial classification, especially in a place like New Orleans. Judge Ferguson also heard Plessis' case. He ruled that the Separate Car Act for travel within the state did not violate the 14th Amendment because equal accommodations were provided to white and Black passengers. The Louisiana Supreme Court upheld the decision. The committee appealed, and the case was eventually heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1896, the court again upheld Ferguson's initial ruling that separate but equal was indeed constitutional. This decision officially sanctioned segregation laws in the South, and it would not be overturned until the 1954 Brown v. the Board of Education case. The Citizens Committee disbanded not long after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of racial segregation. In a final published statement, the committee explained that, quote, notwithstanding this decision, which was rendered contrary to our expectations, we, as free men, still believe that we were right and our cause was sacred. Even in the face of bitter disappointment, Creole activists maintained their pride and determination to fight for their rights as humans and as citizens. And although the struggle to realize their vision of a society built on equality and free of racial prejudice fell short, it left a powerful legacy for future Black activists in Louisiana. So free people of color in New Orleans were activists, they were artisans and artists, builders and entrepreneurs, musicians and teachers, soldiers and scientists, along with poets, politicians, property owners, and philanthropists. Over time, and often against great obstacles, they created a community that made its mark on New Orleans, marks that can still be seen today in the city's built environment, its culture, and of course, its people. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. We have a further reading list for you to peruse, and we are very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neidenbach and Mr. Honore. There's already a question actually in the chat, and it is from Dr. Hazel Lee. It said, did free women of color have the same ownership rights as men before the Civil War? I had understood women, both white and Black, were severely restricted in ownership of property.
They actually did have equal ownership. And the laws in Louisiana were different from a lot of places in the United States before the Civil War, based on our civil law code, rather than the common law code that most of the rest of the United States is under. So like the ideas of coverture and those kinds of laws that basically made wives under husbands, where all the property, even if it began, you know, was owned by the wife or came into the marriage through the wife, went to the husband, was not like that in Louisiana. That was a great question, though. Thank you. And Jari, jump in at any time. Should I stop sharing my screen? It's kind of weird visually for me.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. You can stop sharing your screen. Are there any, does anyone else have any other questions for our illustrious, oh, here we go. Were free people of color ever restricted as to where in the city they could live?
That's also a very good question. And the answer to that is no. It was not at all uncommon for people of all social strata, people of all races and conditions of servitude to live in close quarters immediately next to each other throughout New Orleans, including in the Vieux Carré, in the Faubourg-Marigny, Faubourg-Treme, the Garden District, throughout the city. We don't see efforts at residential segregation until the first few decades of the 20th century, and even those are reeled back very quickly. So no, the answer is they were permitted to live throughout the city, including the uptown Faubourg, such as the Faubourg St. Mary, into Jefferson City and the old city of Lafayette County.
Thank you. All right. So we have another question. How did slaves acquire how did slaves acquire the money to buy their freedom? Were they allowed to have outside jobs, or were they reliant on free family members?
That is another excellent question. During the Spanish period, especially when you had the option of coartación, the law that allowed for self-purchase, the Spanish actually gave enslaved people the right to personal property, which meant that they could earn money, excuse me. So a lot of people would basically rent themselves out. Sundays were kind of a customary day of rest. And so it could be on Sundays, it could be you've worked it out with your enslaver to allow you to rent some of your time out. So a lot of these women, especially who were retail, who were, you know, they were market women, they were selling food, fabrics, you know, things that they've made, like kind of door to door or in the markets. That was a really important way that they earned income. I think, oh, and you mentioned, was it reliant on free families? I mean, definitely that too, especially as time goes on. So in the American period, and in the pre-Civil War period, coartación doesn't exist anymore. Those kinds of deals could sometimes be made between enslaver and enslaved, but that could also be an opportunity for a family member who was free and could earn money to then purchase the freedom of a family member. And that's what happens often when family members are still owned as it gets closer to the Civil War, is because the hurdles to manumit them becomes higher and higher.
All right. So I have a question actually about the recommended reading list and how we can share that. And I can actually get that recommended reading list along with the emails of our illustrious guests, and we can have that emailed out to everyone. I also wanted to let everyone know that on September 17th, we will have the second part of this conversation. The recording will be available as well. Thank you for asking that. That'll probably be on the internet shortly. Well, not today, but within the next week. But we will have the second part of this conversation with a different panel of guests. It will be live at the New Orleans Opera Guild home, but we will endeavor to record that as well. And that conversation is going to be directed at the leaders of New Orleans prominent arts organizations and talking about the responsibility that they have, that we all have to make this knowledge known, because obviously a lot of people in the city don't know about it, and about programming some of, for the musicians in the audience, some of the songs, for highlighting some of the art. So this is not just a one-off. This is not just a conversation that we're throwing out. There's a reason that we're doing this. There's a reason that the Barber of Seville is set in this society in New Orleans. It's very important. And obviously from the response, people do feel like it's something that they wanted to hear. So do we have any other questions for anyone? Actually, I'm here. I think Claire is here. Any other questions? All right. Well, with that being said, since we have no other questions, and I will go ahead and put my email down at the bottom in case anybody thinks of anything. If I can remember how to type. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. We do not take that lightly. We hope to see you for some of our other topics. We will be diving into restaging operas with today's perspective with our next ALLONS conversation, and we will start a series of conversations about Madame Butterfly as well. We hope to see all of you very, very soon, and thank you for coming. Have a great night.